Morning. So I'm sitting with Joerg Rieger. Joerg, thanks for making the time to chat with me today.
Happy to do so.
I really appreciate it. Joerg is Professor, Cal Turner Professor of Theology. Is that right?
That's about right, yeah. Wesleyan Studies and Theology, so both.
Okay, at Vanderbilt University.
Yes.
And I believe you're staging a revolution in the South.
We're trying to, yes, but we're getting closer.
Now, I thought it would be fantastic just to have a chance to chat with Joerg today. So thanks for coming to watch the video. Joerg, tell us a little bit about the projects that you're involved in at the moment. We've been talking a little bit about organizing and issues around labor and class. Tell us a bit about what you're doing at the moment.
So first of all, I'm a theologian, right? That means I do study the questions of God and religion and the big questions of life. But I believe that it's better to study these questions when you're engaged in real-life issues. And then not just real-life issues, but really the burning issues of our time. And so when you look at what those are, you get to the question, how are we all sort of in this together? And for us, we realize that 99% of us have to work for a living, and therefore it's really important to pay attention to issues of work and labor. That's where, a lot of our economic pressures come from. But this is also where other issues sort of come to a head, like the questions of race, questions of gender, sexuality. They also find their expression in what's happening to people at work. So for me, being engaged in labor is really not just an activist issue, but it's a theological core issue. Can talk about God involved in labor issues also, but that's the sort of thing. And so
well, quickly, let's just stop for a moment. That I was referring to it earlier when we were having lunch, your book Theology and Class. I mean, for me that was a real sort of eye-opener to recognize that for 99% of us, we actually have quite a lot of solidarity when it comes to economic and social issues. People like myself who are more educated and have a sort of more stable job, and we sometimes tend to think, well, we're in a sort of upper middle class or something like that. But speak to us a little bit about class.
So in the United States, this is the difficult topic to talk about because people are worried about it, if you can address it, or people think maybe we're all middle class and so we don't have these problems. Or when they talk about class, they talk about layers, like the layers of a cake. You can say, I'm in this class, and then there's a next lower class, and a next higher class. Sociologists sometimes come up with as many as 17 classes.
Okay, wow.
What I'm interested in is different. It's the relationship between, we talk about inequality, right? Poverty and wealth. And so class, the way we're looking at it, is really a relationship. So poor people are poor, but they're poor in relation to people who are not poor. And oftentimes when you start looking closely, you realize that there is not just a relationship, but there's an exploitation going on. So working people work hard, yet in the United States, they work harder and harder. They make less and less money. What happens to the wealth that is produced? Well, it goes to someone, and it's not the 99%. So then you have to talk about how the 99% are experiencing this, and how the 1%, on the other hand, is also part of
course,
that game.
I mean, these are deeply theological issues. I mean, these are issues about justice and, the God who creates and gives opportunity for us to share in God's creation. So they're deeply theological issues.
What's also interesting to me is how this class thinking, we cannot address it openly, but at the same time it shapes us very deeply. So when you ask people, how do you envision God? Well, sometimes, people look up to the ceiling or to the sky, right? Or, as your gaze goes up, well, you see maybe big steeple. You may see a high rise, with the corner offices of the CEOs at the top. So for a lot of people, they think of God probably more like a manager, a CEO, a boss, and they don't think of God as a worker. Now, you could say, well, maybe we should think about God in both ways, but I'm actually arguing there are some real insights when you start thinking about God as worker. And of course, we're not pulling that out of thin air. We find that in the Bible. First, the second creation story in the Bible, there's a story of God making Adam from clay, planting a garden. And what's really interesting is, if God's sort of a manager, CEO, or a king, you'd say, well, God sends his troops, or God sends some migrant workers to plant the garden. No, God plants the garden. God's the one who works with clay. So God's a worker there. Look at the Exodus from Egypt. God takes the side of the working slaves. Jesus, born as a construction worker, and Christians believe Jesus is also God. So, God's embodied, incarnate.
Yeah, it's always an interesting thing for me that particular example when both Jesus and Paul in different ways were they needed to remain active. I always think about how Jesus is identified by members of his community. Isn't this Joseph the carpenter's son? Their primary identification with him is through labor, not through deity, And
it's usually not a compliment, right? It's not, this is who he is, but, what does he know? He's just a worker, right?
Yeah.
And Paul, that's interesting you mentioned Paul, because he continues to be a working person.
Yeah.
And when Paul talks about it, he says, we do this so that we maintain our own independence,
Yeah.
In other words, we're not going to be dependent on big money, We're not going to be the puppets of the 1%.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately, and let me put this very strongly, and this is what I'm concerned about, I think a lot of us have become in the universities and also in the churches, because a lot of church business, in the United States very much depends on big money. Now, I don't say this to just complain. I just say this as an observation, and then my question is, if that's happening, if that's the case, what do we do about it? How do we get beyond that? So my argument here is not, a negative one. There's class struggle and it's also horrible. But once you recognize that there's class struggle, Warren Buffett used to be the second, now probably third or fourth richest person in the world. 10 years ago was asked if there was class struggle, and he said, of course there is, and my class is winning it. Wow. So what do we do about that? That's the positive question.
Yeah. Now, part of your earlier work was around empire. Tell me a little bit about how this relates.
Yeah, that is a great question.
Because I often, just by the way, to say, I often think that as people of faith, our churches, the way in which we construct our societies along these so-called Western Christian virtues and ethics, capitalism, Max Weber's whole thing about the construction of capitalism, that Christianity often provides the sort of software that allows the hardware of injustice to function in society.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah, I like that. So I started working on empire probably a dozen years ago, and in those days, or maybe even a bit longer, what was really my concern was to ask the question, how has empire shaped Christianity? Because if you look back to the early beginnings, Christianity has been born under the conditions of empire. Right? Jesus is born into the Roman Empire, and early Christianity negotiates it, and then at some point it sort of gets taken over by the empire. So it's always a tug of war. And what interests me about empire is the fact that empire seeks to control everything. Now there are different empires, so it's not always just one, but the main point is empire controls not only politics, power, and money. That's clear, we could see that, but empire also seeks to control your religion. So for me, that was a study really of how so much of our Christian thinking has been shaped by empire through history. So in my book, Christ and Empire, I have 7 chapters starting with the Apostle Paul, and then ending with the contemporary situation, which I call the post-colonial empire. And that's sort of what brought me then to economics, because I began to realize, while the Roman Empire is very much sort of structured politically, you have an emperor, you have somebody who is in control, you have the army and all of that. In sort of later years, the more history progresses, today we don't have an emperor like that. Perhaps Trump is trying to live up to that.
45.
But that may not last forever. The Roman Empire didn't last forever either. But more important than that is that things today are driven very much by big money, by capital, and then it's no longer a national thing, it's an international, it's a global thing. So what's happening to you in South Africa is happening to us in the United States. And so looking at economics was really a way of looking at how empire shapes up today. And then my question about economics is not just money and politics. I want to know, how does economics shape us all the way to the core? Our faith, our belief. And I'm really worried that it shapes us too much.
Now, your second last question in a moment, I'm going to ask you just to give us some suggestions for the readers, viewers, what they can read and where they can find your work. But before we get to that, I've been so interested in listening to the work that you've been doing with Walmart workers and your views around how, what happens in Walmart is often a reflection of what's coming in the economy. Tell us a little bit about that particular view, and particularly the importance of organizing, working with labor and organizing.
Thanks for that question. So I've worked a lot of these things through in terms of theology and theory. So there's the Christ and Empire book. There's a book on the Occupy Wall Street movement, Occupy Religion. There's a book on theology and economics that's titled No Rising Tide. But I realized...
Got a goldfish on the cover.
That's right, goldfish in a goldfish bowl, who one of my colleagues says, that goldfish looks really worried. That's exactly where we are. So that's what I did. But I always did this in conjunction with what's happening in real life. And so when you talk about class, when you talk about economics, and then you bring this back to labor, you really have to look at what's happening in everyday lives. And so in Dallas, that was before I went to Vanderbilt, which was 2 years ago. I was at SMU in Dallas, and there for 15 years we worked with the labor movement, and very much as Christians, as people of faith. And so at some point with the Walmart workers, the story is they were trying to organize. Legally, they cannot found a union in the United States because there's laws that prohibit this. But we helped them to organize and build some community anyways. And so one of our efforts was reading the Bible with the Walmart workers. So we sat down, and in Dallas, those were mostly African American workers who all had very strong religious beliefs and convictions. And so we read the Bible together, and the workers came up with their own solutions. They could say, the Bible, when I read the Jesus stories, I learned that maybe the boss is not God. Something else is God, right? I learned that, there is some hope for freedom and liberation, that there's actually good news to the poor, which is more than just the giving of alms, or trying to be nice, charity.
So a far more structural approach to issues rather than just covering over the symptom of it.
That's right, and so that's related to organizing now. Instead of service work where you help people, you're now building power together. So these Walmart workers were trying to form a community, but as they were doing that, we were also forming community. So that was something that we then called deep solidarity, because it's no longer me helping somebody else, but it's part of my story. And so we started organizing. My wife is a community labor organizer. She did a lot of the practical work. And that brought together, working people, church people, brought together some university people, some professors, a few students, pastors. And that was really very amazing, because that rarely happens. Normally we're all somehow segregated. Or, workers might be going to church, but they don't identify as workers in church, right? And so now we were all together identifying as...
we've had the issue at Stellenbosch University where students, academics, and the staff who were contracted to work in kitchens and cleaning in residences really worked together around the Fees Must Fall movement, because those workers were the most precarious. They were on hourly wages, fixed-term contracts. But the students who are the clients and the academic staff, some of whom are tenured, have some prestige, they need to use their deep solidarity, the agency that they have, their privilege, to stand in solidarity with those. Because in some senses, what happens to them, as you've rightly said, eventually happens elsewhere when capital has its way.
That's right. And so this is an important point. The thing really starts with those who are enduring the greatest pressure. So the ones whose lives are most precarious, you really have to pay attention to that. Now, not just to help them, they have their own agency, but really to learn from them and maybe also sometimes get some guidance and to find the places where you can organize, apply some of your privilege. Now, what I found about privilege, so I happen to be a white Euro-American man, that is one way to actually deal with my privilege and to deconstruct it. Because if I, as a white academic who has a prestigious university job, tenure, named chair and all of that, if I put myself in that struggle, I do not go unchanged. Something changes. And of course, not just within me, but also people look at me differently, treat me differently. So I'm still a white man, but I cannot go back home to the good old white boys club because they're not suspicious of me.
Yeah.
And rightly so, as they should be.
Yeah.
But I think this is the Jesus story. If you follow me, that means you might have to leave your family or your loved ones, but you get new brothers and sisters and a new community. So that was part of that. So that's organizing, but then within organizing, you ask the theological question: where is God? And all of a sudden, it occurs to you maybe God is in this organizing somewhere also. And so as you build new relationships with people, you're strengthening, deepening your relationship with God. So that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful image and a wonderful image for us to end our conversation on. But I tend to buy that as well. The God who is in deep solidarity with God's own creation.
Exactly.
And the closer we get to one another, as we heard in a message last night, the closer we get to God, and the closer we get to God, the closer we need to be to one another.
And this is the work that you have also done. So
yeah.
It's really good to be talking about this together.
Yeah, well, thanks. You tell our viewers a little bit, where can they go to get some of your stuff, your books, articles?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that's available in the South African market, but you can also go to my website, which, of course, you have to spell my name.
And I'll stick it in the show notes.
Okay, very good. So, joergrieger.com. You see a lot of my publications, my books. My most recent book might be of interest, especially it's titled Jesus versus Caesar. Picks up the old empire image, but the subtitle is For People Tired of Serving the Wrong God.
Beautiful. I've seen the cover, red, lovely cover. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that.
And some people say there's Jesus on the cover, there's Caesar on the cover. He looks like a current U.S. president, Caesar does. That was unintentional, but there may be a lesson here also.
Yeah.
But that's one book that I would recommend because it deals with the big problem that's before us today, which is Christianity versus itself. So there's sort of within Christianity all kinds of forces that seek to either derail us, or mislead us in a way that's very troublesome, and so that's one piece.
And just to say, that's not unique to the United States. I mean, we've seen that in South Africa as well. The real politicization of religion, and not in a positive sense, not looking at how our faith is political and can drive change, but
that was the
party
old problem.
politics.
That was the old problem of fascism in Germany too. So my own German heritage, where religion was not fighting fascism, but in so many ways, well, of course he was doing that too, and we have many good examples, but for the most part, the majority was on the wrong side of the issue, supporting fascism instead of fighting it.
Yeah.
The other book I want to mention is the one I co-authored with my wife, Unified We're a Force, How Faith and Labor Can Overcome America's Inequality.
Excellent.
So we talk about America there, but it's really a global project. The book was just translated into German,
okay.
So the Germans are now talking about it.
Okay.
We'd love to talk about this in South Africa at some point.
Excellent.
Because we learned some of these lessons in South Africa.
Yeah.
2008, we were there for a couple of months.
Yeah,
and,
we visited when you were there.
Those were great times, and so we learned a lot there. And then our own struggle. Of course, most of it really comes out of our on-the-ground experiences for years and years.
Excellent. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. But Joerg, thanks so much for a great conversation this afternoon, but more importantly for the work that you're doing. It's an inspiration. I've known you, I think now, I was just thinking about it this morning, since I think we met at the Oxford Institute in 2007.
Oh my goodness.
So that's 11 years ago.
That was before I came to South Africa.
We were both younger men then.
That's right, yeah. Well, you're still very young. My hair is getting grey. So.
But Joerg, thanks so much for the work that you do and the person that you are. And by the way, the other thing is that Joerg drives a motorbike like I do, and so we share that in common. And he's written a great book on travel.
That's true. Yes, that came out in the second edition now. Faith on the Road: A Short Theology of Travel and Justice.
Yeah.
So that's
that. And just to say, I read that book when really the issue of migration and immigration became such a big issue, and it really helped me to think through that very carefully. So
thanks.
I
appreciate that.
Well, thanks, Joerg. We really appreciate
Dion,
it.
Always a pleasure.
Great, and we'll put some links in the show notes to Joerg's website and to some of those books. So thanks for watching. Leave us a comment if you've got any questions. I'll make sure that we feed those that can get through. We'll feed those through to Joerg. And please have a look at some of the other videos on the channel and see if there's something that you find useful. But thanks for watching. We look forward to catching up again with you soon.